Isaac Newton stands in a chaotic London street, clutching a fistful of papers, staring obsessively at a board of chalked stock prices. This is one of the smartest men who ever lived, and he is about to make the worst financial decision of his entire life. This is the true story of the South Sea Bubble. It started 9 years earlier, with a company that barely did any real business at all. Before this ends, an entire nation will go bankrupt and Parliament itself will be caught taking bribes. In 1711, a merchant named John Blunt and a statesman named Robert Harley founded the South Sea Company. Britain was drowning in debt after decades of war, and the company offered a clever solution: manage the debt in exchange for a trade monopoly. The company was granted exclusive rights to trade with Spanish South America, a deal that sounded incredibly lucrative. There was just one problem. Spain still controlled those ports and barely let a single British ship through. For 9 quiet years, the company did almost no real trade at all. Somehow, investors barely seemed to notice. John Blunt wasn't especially interested in shipping anyway. He was interested in something far more profitable: debt itself. Britain owed an almost unimaginable sum after years of war, tens of millions of pounds in outstanding government debt. Blunt had a plan to turn that mountain of debt into the greatest fortune anyone in Britain had ever seen. In January 1720, he proposed something audacious: let the South Sea Company absorb the country's entire national debt. Government bondholders would trade their old debt for brand new company shares instead. The company would profit from the enormous gap between what it sold new shares for and the low value of the debt it absorbed. But first, Blunt needed something crucial: Parliament's approval. And Parliament, it turned out, wasn't cheap. Company shares were quietly handed to members of Parliament, entirely free of charge, in exchange for their votes. Some lawmakers didn't even have to pay for the stock at all. They simply pocketed the profit once it sold. The bribery worked exactly as planned. In April of 1720, Parliament approved the scheme. The South Sea Company now controlled the entire national debt of Great Britain. All it needed now was a share price high enough to make the whole scheme wildly profitable. So the company set out to convince all of Britain that this stock was the opportunity of a lifetime. Rumors spread of secret deals with Spain, of ships soon to be loaded with gold and silver. None of it was remotely true, but the rumors worked exactly as intended. Share prices began to climb: £128, then £300, then £400 a share. Word spread through every coffee house and drawing room in London. Everyone, somehow, was getting rich. Servants, shopkeepers, dukes, and duchesses alike rushed to buy shares in a company that had barely shipped a single crate of cargo. Copycat companies sprang up almost overnight, each promising equally outlandish returns to anyone willing to invest. One infamous company reportedly raised money for, quote, a venture of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. People bought shares in it anyway, without asking a single question. Britain had entered a full-blown speculative mania, and almost nobody wanted to be the one left out of it. Exchange Alley in London became a chaotic marketplace, packed wall to wall with shouting brokers and desperate investors. By June of 1720, the share price had climbed past £700. It seemed like the entire country had somehow found a way to get rich without doing any real work at all. Among the investors swept up in the excitement was Sir Isaac Newton, one of the most brilliant minds in all of Europe. Newton had bought early, and by April, he'd already sold his shares for a tidy profit of about £7,000. He should have walked away completely satisfied, his fortune safely secured. But the stock kept climbing, and Newton, like everyone else around him, watched other people get richer by the day. In June, unable to resist any longer, Newton bought back in. This time, dangerously close to the very top of the market. He wasn't alone in that mistake. Practically the entire educated elite of Britain did exactly the same thing. Even the sharpest minds in the country couldn't resist the pull of a story that felt far too good to actually question. What none of them realized yet was just how fragile the whole scheme had already quietly become. By August of 1720, South Sea stock had rocketed to an almost unbelievable £1,000 a share. To keep that price climbing even higher, Blunt introduced a dangerous new trick. The company itself began lending money directly to investors, specifically so they could buy even more of its own stock. It was a scheme built entirely on borrowed money, propping up a price with no real business left underneath it. As long as prices kept climbing, none of those debts seemed to matter at all. But the very moment prices stopped rising, every single one of those loans would come due at once. Nobody wanted to think about that, not while the money kept flowing in so easily. For a few golden weeks that summer, it genuinely felt like nothing could possibly go wrong. Then, quietly, in the final days of August, something began to change. Company insiders, men who understood the real business better than anyone, started quietly selling their own personal shares. They said nothing publicly. They simply sold and moved their money somewhere far safer. Word slowly began to spread that the men at the very top no longer believed their own story. Share prices stalled for the very first time in months. It was a small crack in the foundation, but it was more than enough. In September, the price began to fall, slowly at first, and then much, much faster. Investors who had borrowed heavily to buy shares were suddenly ordered to repay their loans in full. To cover those debts, they had no choice left but to sell their stock immediately. Every forced sale pushed the price down even further, triggering yet another wave of forced selling. It was a landslide that fed itself, and it showed absolutely no sign of stopping. By the end of September, shares that had traded at £1,000 had collapsed to just 150. Fortunes built in a matter of weeks were wiped out in a matter of days. Investors who had mortgaged their homes and sold their land to buy shares were left with nothing at all. Panic tore through London's banks and goldsmiths, many of whom had lent heavily against South Sea stock. Several collapsed entirely within days of one another. The panic didn't stop at Britain's shores. Amsterdam's financial markets, closely tied to London's, began to buckle under exactly the same pressure. Across the English Channel, France was suffering an eerily similar collapse of its own. A scheme called the Mississippi Company, built on almost identical promises, was crashing at nearly the same moment. Two of Europe's great financial powers had built their fortunes on precisely the same kind of illusion. And both illusions were now collapsing at exactly the same time. Back in London, Isaac Newton watched his second investment collapse right along with everyone else's. He had bought back in near the very top of the market, and now he was paying dearly for it. Estimates suggest Newton lost around £20,000, a genuine fortune, and a devastating personal blow. He later said, simply, that he could calculate the motion of the planets, but not the madness of people. Newton was far from alone. Thousands of ordinary Britons had lost absolutely everything they owned. Servants who had invested their entire life savings were left completely destitute overnight. Families who had sold their homes to buy shares now had neither a home nor any money left at all. The press turned the entire disaster into public mockery, printing cruel satirical cartoons of the ruined investors. They were nicknamed the Bubblers, fools who had chased a fortune that was never actually real. Ballads and pamphlets mocked the greed and gullibility of an entire nation, from the palace down to the street. But underneath all that mockery was a much darker, much more uncomfortable truth. This hadn't just been a case of foolish investors. It had been a case of deliberate, engineered deception. In early 1721, Parliament launched a formal investigation into exactly what had happened. A secret committee met behind closed doors for months, digging carefully through the company's private records. What they eventually found was staggering. Company insiders had manipulated share prices, hidden losses, and quietly funneled stock to politicians in exchange for favorable votes. John Blunt, the very architect of the entire scheme, was called to testify before the committee. In exchange for leniency, he handed over the names of every man he had personally bribed. Some of Britain's most powerful politicians had secretly taken company shares in return for pushing the scheme through Parliament. The scandal reached all the way into the very heart of the British government itself. Several members of Parliament were publicly exposed as having accepted bribes to approve the original debt scheme. Some resigned in complete disgrace. A few were expelled from Parliament entirely. One government minister was sent to the Tower of London to await trial for his role in the corruption. Company directors had their personal estates seized by Parliament, the proceeds used to partially repay the ruined investors. It wasn't nearly enough to cover everyone's devastating losses, but it was something. For the very first time, the British public watched their own government publicly admit it had been complicit in the fraud. Trust in Parliament, and in the entire financial system, was shattered almost completely. Something had to change, or the whole country risked collapsing into permanent financial chaos. Into that chaos stepped a determined politician named Robert Walpole. Walpole hadn't been deeply involved in the original scheme, which made him one of the few men Parliament still actually trusted. He was handed the almost impossible task of rebuilding Britain's completely shattered finances. Walpole spread the surviving South Sea stock across other institutions, slowly stabilizing the economy over the following months. His skillful handling of the crisis elevated him to First Lord of the Treasury, a role that would one day evolve into what we now call Prime Minister. In the years that followed, Parliament passed new laws restricting how companies could even be formed, hoping to prevent another bubble like this one. It was one of the world's very first real attempts at genuine financial regulation. But no regulation could ever undo what had already happened to hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. The men who designed the South Sea bubble profited enormously, and most walked away with their fortunes still largely intact. The people who paid the real price were the ordinary investors who had simply trusted a system built to deceive them. In finance, just like in history, the cleverest schemes rarely punish the people who actually invented them.